You're watching Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up in the final show of the season. What a week and what a year for media disinformation. Award-winning journalist and filmmaker John Pilger gives us his take on the highlights. And I can't breathe. No, not Ferguson, Missouri, but Heathrow Airport. We talk to the widow of Jimmy Mubenga, unlawfully killed, but seemingly not by G4S. Plus, we march with those who want to put an end to violence against sex workers. Actor Rupert Everett tells us why he is campaigning with them. All this and more on today's Going Underground. So, after another year of Going Underground exposing corruption and contradictions, who better to invite back to the show than award-winning journalist and filmmaker John Pilger? We talked about torture, terror, Russia, and of course the media. Welcome back to Going Underground. John, let's begin with why you thought both the media and the political response to the US Senate torture report was grotesque.
Well, I thought it. I turned on the BBC onto Newsnight, and the whole tenor of it was, does torture work? There was a question over that. The Senate report had suggested perhaps that it didn't work. I mean, it was a surreal kind of reporting. The very idea that this is new, that this represents something that has only happened since 9/11 is itself absurd. Modern British colonial history is steeped in torture. The British were the masters at it in many ways. Kenya, it's documented. Malaya, it's documented. Much of the atrocities, the strategic atrocities that happened in Vietnam came from here. The CIA itself, when it became the CIA, it was originally the OSS at the end of the Second World War. When it became the CIA, it split into two sections, basically. One, an intelligence gathering section, the other, a covert operations arm of the presidency, in effect. That covert operations arm, the central part of it was torture.
And yet they aren't looking at Britain as being the source of torture. They're looking at whether it works. Is that the only way then they can comprehend a report like the Feinstein report?
I don't know. I think the whole, I hesitate to use that noble word, culture, of apologizing for the state, of minimizing the culpability of the state, whether it's contemporary or historic, is so ingrained that it has burrowed its way into the consciousness of people who call themselves defense and diplomatic correspondents, and yet stand up in front of a BBC camera as the defense correspondent of Newsnight did some months ago, and he was appraising why the Middle East is in a mess. Not once did he mention the role of Britain in the Middle East. Britain, which is responsible from its imperial days and in the present day to so much of the mayhem in the Middle East, was airbrushed. So I can only think that perhaps it's being generous, but that they've internalized all this nonsense, and especially this denialism, these apologetics, so significantly that the news has become, at times like this, almost raw propaganda.
What did you think of Ed Miliband very noticeably not calling for a judicial inquiry? Of course, David Miliband was in that Blair cabinet. What did you think of the fact he didn't
I don't know
one?
whether he's protecting his brother or not. I have no
old Labour
inside
colleagues.
knowledge. I'd be surprised if he didn't do that. There is a consensus, and that consensus is to cover up. The same thing happened during the Arms to Iraq inquiry, when the judge, the only person that I remember the judge commending was a former Foreign Office official who described the Foreign Office in relation to the arms to Iraq scandal as a culture of lying. And at the time, the numbers of people from high in the British establishment who'd really committed or were accessories to serious offences, criminal offences, numbered in the dozens. So the fact that people don't know this, the suggestion rather they don't know it, is absurd.
Let's just go to Russia then. And within hours of that horrible massacre in Peshawar, the media again was talking about, this time, the collapse of Russia. What should we expect about Russia in the mainstream media in the next 12 months?
I think I have to say, in my career as a journalist, I've never known the truth so inverted on one issue, an issue that's extremely dangerous. We're in the midst of a Cold War that I think is more dangerous than the Cold War I grew up with. And I grew up with the kind of raw propaganda that we're now seeing here. We're seeing demonology by media, we're seeing the turning inside out of facts by media, and if we're not careful, we're going to end up with a major war and even the possibility, the real possibility, of a nuclear war, and much of it drumbeaten by media in the same way that the invasion of Iraq was in 2003. There are great similarities between them because it involves fiction. The idea that Russia is somehow attacking the West, when the actual story behind this should have been obvious recently, when oil prices were driven down clearly after with the agreement between the United States and the Saudis. The reason for doing that was to wreck the Russian economy. The reason for moving into Ukraine, and it's that way, not the Russian way, that NATO, the United States and its proxies have taken over Ukraine. I'll give you one example, to the point where Joe Biden, the Vice President Joe Biden's son, L. Hunter Biden, is on the board of one of the fracking companies. Now, there was a very important conference at Yalta in September 2013, attended by all the main players, in which the takeover of Ukraine was planned. People like the Clintons and members of the administration, the fracking companies, the great agricultural multinationals like Cargill, which are now in Ukraine. It was a takeover of Ukraine. And this could have only been done by a coup. And that coup was stage managed by the Obama administration. The blame has been shifted directly to Russia. Every move that Russia has made has been defensive. The annexation of Crimea is entirely defensive. Otherwise, it would end up as a NATO base. No question about that. But the way this is portrayed in the West, and I feel particularly strongly because I grew up with this kind of late 50s, 60s propaganda right through the Cold War. The way it's being portrayed in the West, that Russia is being led by another Stalin, or as Hillary Clinton called Putin, another Hitler, how perverse. And that there is the real prospect of war. But Russia isn't Iraq. Russia is a nuclear power, and with an extremely powerful conventional military force. Putin himself has stopped talking diplomatically, as he's been speaking for right through most of this Ukrainian situation, in order to diffuse it, as clearly they're worried, and has started talking red lines himself. It's so dangerous, and it's being promoted by extraordinary propaganda in what is meant to be a free media, those who are meant to keep the record straight in this country, Britain, in the United States, elsewhere in Europe, are playing this whole demonizing of Russia. But in fact, it may end up being self-fulfilling. It's such a danger.
Well, there is one beam of light here, and it's your next film, the American War with China. Maybe it's hard to get funding. You've discovered a completely different way to fund that dissent when it comes to broadcasting dissent.
Yes, I've had to go to what is known as crowdfunding, to which I'm very new, and I've been absolutely touched by the numbers of people who have given mostly small amounts over a period of a week and brought us almost to half the sum that we need to begin making this film. It's quite a, it's quite a phenomenon, and that's a bright spot, yes, that you can appeal directly to the public for funding.
John Pilger, thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want to see our full interview with John Pilger, it's up on our YouTube channel, where you'll also find our review of the final Prime Minister's Questions of the Year. Meanwhile, coming up in part 2 of Going Underground, how can an unlawful killing mean acquittal for G4S? We talk to the widow of Jimmy Mubenga. And actor Rupert Everett tells us about the plight of women who fight police raids and evictions on a daily basis just to stay alive. All this and more after the break. This week, guards from private government contractor G4S were acquitted of killing Jimmy Mubenga at Heathrow Airport as he was about to be deported. Echoing the death of Eric Garner in America at the hands of US police, Mubenga complained of not being able to breathe before he died. With us is Jimmy's widow, Adrienne Makenda Kabana. Thank you, Adrienne, for coming to Going Underground. So how could there be an acquittal of an unlawful killing?
I was shocked. Yeah, because in inquest, the guards was found them enough killing. But coming to the court, they found them not guilty.
Were you expecting a guilty verdict?
Yes, I was expecting for them to be guilty. Even explains how they found them not guilty.
Some G4S guards had racist messages on their phones. If the courts had heard that, maybe the jury would have a different verdict?
Yes, that's one, because the judge would allow, the jury should know, because there is a text message we found to their Facebook by the police. I don't know why the judge would allow it.
And your campaign for monitors, independent monitors?
Yes, I would like to plead the Home Office if they can put the monitor and the body camera, because nobody knows the truth. The G4S said they are not responsible for Jimmy's death. Who is? That's my question. My children, we will be asking that question for all our life.
And the effect on your family?
My daughter, she was 7 months on that time. Now she's 4.5. She's asking me, where is Daddy? Every morning before she goes to school, Mommy, where is Daddy? I don't have answer. I'm scared. But I need the government, the law, to help me for that, to give me an answer. Who killed Jimmy? Who killed Jimmy if it's not G4S? But me and my family, we know it's G4S. And now they found them not guilty. They can feel free, but they know their hand is dirty. It's full of blood of Jimmy. Everywhere they go, they will hear Jimmy's voice telling them, I can't breathe. That's why I'm wearing my T-shirt, to tell all the world how Jimmy was telling them. They will live with that. We are going to live with the pain they as well, they're gonna live with Jimmy's voice. If until they come out and tell us the truth, they done it.
Adrienne, thank you.
You're welcome.
We approached G4S for comment about allegations against them in this program, but they didn't get back to us in time for broadcast. With us now to discuss the court case and what needs to be changed with the transportation of migrants is Deborah Coles, co-founder of INQUEST, who has been involved in the case of Jimmy Mubenga since it began. Welcome to Going Underground, Deborah. So why were the racist text messages not seen as admissible evidence in this case?
Well, that's a very good question, particularly considering that they were deemed as relevant at the coroner's inquest. And I think it raises questions about how the trial was conducted. I mean, clearly the judge made this decision, and it's one that we find very difficult to reconcile, particularly given that the coroner at the inquest recognised that racism, and the really endemic racism, I think, that we know about the deportation process, should have been relevant in terms of concerns about the treatment of people who are being deported. So, I mean, my biggest concern about this case is the fact that it is very, very difficult for all of us to reconcile the jury verdict with the evidence that was heard during the trial, not least the fact that 20 individuals said that they heard Jimmy Mubenga say he couldn't breathe and he needed help. And he died, and the medical experts all agreed that his death was caused by the restraint used against him. So I do think that where you have officials of the state doing functions of the state and who are entitled to use force, then the fact that they were sharing racist texts and really extremely...
Not just a few, right?
Oh no, these were streams of grossly offensive texts about people of colour, about immigrants. I mean, you know, it was shocking for all of us who heard this during the course of the inquest. And that has to be a relevant factor when one considers that they're involved in deporting people from this country. And I think that for me, what it does point to, I mean, this is taking us away from the inquest and the trial, but we have a deportation process in this country that is privately run. The state has outsourced its functions. It is a system that is motivated by profit. And there are well-documented concerns about excessive force and about racist treatment. And I think that we should all be extremely shocked that not only does a man lose his life, but nobody, either at an individual or institutional level, has been made accountable for that. And that goes for not just the importance of individual accountability, but in terms of G4S and the Home Office had responsibility for monitoring that contract.
And just finally, do you think that it'll be the millions of pounds the taxpayer has to pay in compensation rather than the actual unlawful killings of people that may change government policy so something like Jimmy Mubenga's case never happens again?
No, I mean, and I certainly think from the point of view of any of the families who we've worked with, I mean, their motivation, and Adrienne has been absolutely fantastic in trying to ensure that no other family has to go what she's gone through. I think ultimately we have a process here where profit is primary, and to be quite frank, deaths of people like Jimmy Mubenga are not a real concern. I think you're right in terms of, you know, how can we in a way get a different kind of accountability, which is kind of have some kind of dent in the profits. But ultimately, we as a society, I think, must ask questions about whether or not it's ever acceptable to have a situation where people can die and nobody can be held accountable for that. And I think this is a particularly shameful case. But unfortunately, you know, I work for an organisation. We've worked on a lot of cases following the use of restraint, and it's still an ongoing issue of concern, and it's for us and other NGOs and for the families to make sure we never forget those who've died. And forever, Jimmy Mubenga will be, I think, a mark of shame, really, in terms of how a system has treated an individual.
Deborah Coles, thank you.
Thank you very much.
This week, Christmas revelry in London's West End was interrupted by a march as part of an international day to end violence against sex workers. One of the campaigners was the writer and actor Rupert Everett. We caught up with him in the heart of Soho, where a centuries-old trade is under threat from a perfect storm of austerity, local councils, law enforcement, and property empires. Rupert, tell us about this week's march in Soho.
Well, it was organised by the Prostitutes Cooperative, and it started in Soho Square and ended up at St Anne's Church, the vicarage, for a kind of rally and a get-together, and it was really amazing. What it's a march about is about the total decriminalisation of prostitution.
What is legal and what is illegal at the moment?
Well, it's a very grey area. It's legal to work alone. It's not legal to work in a brothel, for example, which is obviously the most sensible thing for a sex worker to be involved in. Working alone, it makes life much more dangerous. At the moment, we've just managed to stop for the time being this notion of the criminalisation of the sex worker's client. This also will be a disaster because it will drive the sex worker back into car parks and parks and into greater danger. So
this was part of the modern slavery bill, which had cross-party support, and they didn't think to realise that one of the effects of the bill would be.
Well, no, one of the amendments in the bill made, suggested by MP called Fiona McTaggart, was to criminalise the client of the prostitute. The thing is, trafficking and sex work have come to mean the same thing, and they are not. Of course, it's my understanding that there are probably between 4 and 6% of the sex workers in the UK are trafficked, and this is a real and terrible issue, but there are perfectly good laws against slavery. What we need for sex workers is for them to be protected, to be safe, and to be respected.
I went to the meeting, and what astonished me was the fact that, precisely what you're saying, the trafficking debate has got somehow mixed up with property companies using law enforcement against sex workers.
Well, what happened last year, and I found this out because I happened to be making a documentary about prostitution, and I'd met lots of the girls who work in Soho and their maids, and one night I was coming back from the theatre to witness this extraordinary police raid on a property called Walker's Court, which is the little alleyway between Brewer Street in Soho.
Just near where we are here.
Yeah, and 300 or something policemen in kind of riot gear, it looked like Armageddon, dragging girls out and putting them in paddy wagons, and all this was in the name basically of trafficking. I then followed some of these girls to court, where they went to Hammersmith Crown Court to appeal their evictions. They were evicted just before Christmas. These girls, they were obviously dignified, intelligent, truthful. They explained to the judge how they came to be in the flats, that they worked of their own accord. The police told another story, that they were being coerced and controlled, and the judge came down on the side of the police and they were evicted. Straight after, it transpired that Soho Estates had made a plan to redevelop Walker's Court as 2 sky-rise buildings replete with heliports on top. They had permission from Westminster Council and from the British Heritage. So, in fact, I think the real sluts in this story, and really the most corrupt side of our culture, are the councils. Westminster Council is out of line here, and in every single way they deal with Soho, actually, because as soon as Crosswell comes, for example, Soho really will be finished, but for the time being we've got to try and hold on to it. Sex workers are an integral part of the culture here. They've been blamed for everything, for drugs, everything is pushed onto them. It's simply not true. Anyone who lives there here will tell you that they're very respectful and good neighbours to have. It's a land grab. It's a very jaded land grab under the banner disguised as morality and the fight against slavery. And it's all bull.
Do you think the police have calmed down now because of this campaign and the march? Many of these places have reopened since that horrific raid.
I think so far it's been quite a victory for the girls. They've managed to fight hard, but you know it's at a great cost. And the police never seem to give up, and nor will Westminster Council. But I think they have to listen to the people at some point.
So in an age of austerity, where arguably there are more sex workers, maybe right around the country.
Well, poverty has forced a lot of people into sex work. Of course, if you have to feed children and you don't have any money to do it, that's one way of doing it.
And just finally, what about the politics of it? What sort of cross-party support can you get to stop communities like those in Soho and other communities up in the country not being dominated by big property companies?
I don't think you can get any. I think all across the parties, the women in Parliament are afraid of the feminists. We're bombarded by extremism outside the country and in. And the extreme feminists, for example, in this issue, they don't think the sex workers have a brain of their own to make their own decisions.
Particular branches of feminism, it should be said, not all of them.
Well, sellable feminism, a lot of lady MPs wouldn't dare come out in favour of prostitutes' rights, I don't think.
And just what now for the campaign then?
What now? Just to go on towards total decriminalisation of sex work.
Rupert Everett, thank you.
Thank you.
Soho Estates told us,
"We reject the allegation, which is simply not true. Soho Estates has no quarrel with legal sex work. We have a long history of operating in the area and supporting the local community. In relation to the specific case of Walker's Court, we sought the removal of sex workers occupying 4 flats as part of our redevelopment plans. This was done in accordance with the lease agreements and reflects our decision to redevelop this specific area. It was not a response to any police initiative."
A Westminster City Council spokesperson told us that
This was a police-led operation to keep people safe from harm. It has absolutely nothing to do with redevelopment.
That's it for today's show, and this season from Monday we'll be broadcasting some of your favourite interviews, but we'll be back in action in January. All through the holiday period, you'll still be able to connect to us via Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud and email. See you soon.